Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Kyla Hannington, the Public Engagement and Outreach Division Manager for the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. And it is my pleasure once again to welcome you to another one of our events with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who have been our wonderful event partners at this point now for many years, and over the last couple of years in the virtual space of the pandemic. And we're extremely grateful for them tonight, as always. It's actually the library's 75th anniversary in 2022, and it is the Office of Human Rights' 50th anniversary. And we are celebrating our 50th year by honoring the spirit of Teresa Douglas Banks, who was a major advocate for the formation of our agency. She's an active Prince Georgian. She ran for school board. She was on the first town council of the town of Glenarden. She was a teacher who fought for wage parity between African-American and white teachers in Prince George's County. She was active in her church. She helped form a Chapel Hill Chapel Oaks Volunteer Fire Department. Basically anything that you can think of to do with volunteerism and civic service, she was there doing it. And we look to her as our guiding light about being involved in our community, fighting for equity, and really working to make Prince George's all that it can be. So thank you to Teresa Douglas Banks. And thank you to all of you for being with us tonight as we welcome John and Elizabeth Stintzi about their new book, My Volcano. So on June 2nd, 2016, a protrusion of rock growing from the Central Park Reservoir is spotted by a jogger. 3 weeks later, when it finally stops growing, it's nearly 2.5 miles tall and has been determined to be an active volcano. As the volcano grows and then looms over New York, an 8-year-old boy in Mexico City finds himself transported 500 years into the past, where he witnesses the fall of the Aztec Empire. A Nigerian scholar in Tokyo studies a folk tale about a woman of fire who descends a mountain and destroys an entire village. A white trans writer in Jersey City struggles to write a sci-fi novel about a thriving civilization on an impossible planet. A nurse tends to Syrian refugees in Greece while while grappling with the trauma of living through the bombing of a hospital in Afghanistan. A nomadic farmer in Mongolia is stung by a bee, magically transforming him into a green, thorn, flowering creature that aspires to connect every living thing into its consciousness. With its riveting and audacious vision, My Volcano is a tapestry on fire, a distorted and synonymic new work from the fiercely talented John and Elizabeth Stintzi. We are thrilled to have Jess with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Jess is a non-binary and trans novelist, poet, visual artist, and teacher who was born and raised on a cattle farm in northwestern Ontario. Their work has received support from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Watermill Centre, and has been awarded the RBC Bronwyn Wallace Award for Emerging Writers from the Writers' Trust of Canada, and the inaugural Sator New Works Award from $2 Radio. Jess was also awarded the Malahat Review's Long Poem Prize in 2019. Their novel Vanishing Monuments was shortlisted for the Amazon Canada First Novel Award, and Junebat was shortlisted for the Raymond Suster Award from the League of Canadian Poets. Jess's work has been published throughout the United States and Canada since 2013 in places like Ploughshares, Kenyon Review, Black Warrior Review, the Malahat Review, the Fiddlehead, and the Best Canadian Poetry. As an aside, those are all places where I've recently had rejections, so congratulations. They are also the author. I was like, every single one of those, I was like, wait. They are also the author of 2 poetry chapbooks, Plough Forward, the Higgs Field, from fall 2019, and the Machete Tourist from Knife Fork Book in spring 2018. They currently live with their wife, as well as a dog named Grendel, in Kansas City, Missouri, where they teach writing at the Kansas City Art Institute and are a studio resident at Charlotte Street. So thank you again so much for being with us. We're thrilled to have you.
Welcome, welcome. We have a lot to talk about, Jess. So maybe I know that this book only became available 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So if perhaps you could set the foundation for our discussion, if you could read for us a little bit to.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It would be my honor. So yeah, I'm going to read from My Volcano. I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'll read the first section, and then I'll they're each numbered, so I'll say what number it is. So they'll get a little bit longer as we go. But I'm going to start with the beginning just because it's a good place to start. 1. The jogger, the first person to see the peak of the volcano sprouting from the middle of the reservoir in Central Park in the early hours of June 2nd, thought the volcano was a breaching humpback whale. But a split second turned to 2, turned to 5. The jogger didn't see the form rise or fall, and it peaked at only about 8 feet high from the surface of the water. She stared at it for a full minute, stretching all the while before continuing her run. She couldn't afford to stop any longer because she didn't want her heart rate to drop. By noon, the same jogger would approach a local news show crew in the park, saying that she was the first to have seen it. She was, and that her mind first thought it was a humpback whale. On several of the evening news broadcasts, they put a photo of the volcano rising in the park next to a photo of a humpback whale breaching off the coast of Rockaway Beach, perfectly foregrounding the Empire State Building. Viewers were asked to respond on social media if they thought there was a resemblance or not. 2 news anchors believed the resemblance was there, but 4 others didn't. A great many people mocked the jogger relentlessly on Twitter. Near as many people commented on her looks. When asked why she, the jogger, didn't report what she'd seen when she first saw it, she didn't have an answer. She grew quiet. The dead air that followed filled the noise-hungry microphone with the sound of camera mirrors flapping until she added, "You never think you're seeing something new anymore." I figured it was old news. I didn't want to say anything because I thought because someone would tell me that they already knew, that everyone knew. Also, I had 6 more miles to run. 5. On June 2nd, in central Mongolia, a bumblebee landed on the bloom of a Mongolian thistle, a singular bloom with a mutation that blotched the flower's white petals and its pollen with a near luminescent purple. The bee was tired, diligent, and messy as it stuck the pollen all along its legs. As it took off to visit another bloom, its smooth stinger was dusted a bright purple. Later, on June 3rd, the bumblebee got caught in the hood of Jambul, a nomadic herder whose cattle and horses were moving through the area the bee had been pollinating. The bee, in the dark of the hood, felt threatened and stung the herder on the cheek near his eye. He yowled and slapped at his cheek, but the bee flew back out of the hood, escaping. Jambul doubled over atop his horse, awed, in pain, the rest of his animals looking at him suspiciously as he held his swelling face. Into his bloodstream went the bee's venom and the pollen of the thistle. 9. On June 10th, Dr. Etna Elgin woke up thousands of feet above Manhattan, Kansas, in a window seat in coach. It was around 2:30 p.m. It was already June 10th when she left Duncan's little apartment in Toshima, Tokyo, about 6 hours before she got on her 10-hour plane ride from Haneda to LAX at 2 p.m. She reviewed data on her laptop in a lounge in Haneda until her flight took off, still in Japan despite her note saying that her flight left early. As she worked, she watched Duncan sleep on the live stream video from his apartment, watched Duncan wake up and read her note, watched Duncan's face shift as he realized she was already thousands of miles away from him, watched Duncan put down the note and shower. There were around 400 steady viewers watching along with her. The clock on the screen on the back of the seat in front of her ticked along, 2:31 p.m., 2:33 p.m., as if it had only been half an hour since she took off from Japan, and she looked out the window at the blank America beneath, the quintessential flyover state out of all the flyover states. She knew that she was looking down at Manhattan because the little airplane on her screen was just passing over its dot. Etna thought about the absurdity of a mountain sprouting from Central Park, one that was nearly 200 feet tall by then, around 20 stories. And she thought about the panel she was meant to be presenting on at U-Tokyo, which Duncan was mediating, on noise-based monitoring of volcanic unrest. It was not yet confirmed that the mountain was a volcano because Etna was not yet in New York, because the rest of her colleagues were still in the air elsewhere, due to be landing soon. Dr. Etna Elga didn't think about that then. The future. She was focused on the flat earth below, on trying to decide if the panel had already happened. Maybe Duncan was still asleep. Maybe he hadn't noticed she was gone or hadn't found her note. Time seemed to be in many unequal pieces as she looked out on June 10th and imagined what it must be like to live in a heightless world, a world that did not have any significant peak or depth. At 35 and as a professor of volcanology, Etna struggled to imagine what it must be like to live a life without mountains, without stratovolcano. She looked away from the window and back to the plane on the map on the screen, where where the letters making up the shortest Manhattan in America blipped away behind the plane, replaced ahead with Topeka, with Lawrence, with St. Joseph, with Independence. And I'll read one more section. And this is from a character who's sort of in something weird has happened to her, and she's suddenly being sort of haunted by these very lucid sleep paralysis dreams. So that's the sort of context you need. And there's a weird lemon that's involved, but you'll have to read it to find out more about that. But 64. Every night that followed June 21st, Michaela's sleep paralysis dreams continued, no matter what she did. She tried getting drunk, being sober, not eating all day, meditating, masturbating, sleeping on the floor, smoking marijuana, and hooking up with random girls from a variety of dating apps. But every time she closed her eyes, she still found herself opening them in the body of someone else, living a life paired with the ever-present sense of something looming outside her vision. No matter what she did, she woke up every morning with the lemon in her hand. The only thing Michaela didn't try changing before she went to sleep every night was watching the live stream of the man in Tokyo, which at times showed nothing but an empty apartment, it being mid-afternoon in Japan by the time Michaela went to bed. She couldn't bring herself to stop that habit because she knew that if her head hit the pillow in utter darkness, her mind would take her deeper, down toward the many pains inside. Seeing that man existing in his life, banal as it was, made Michaela feel like she was suspended in the quiet air or floating on a waveless sea. She felt so much like so much more. She felt like so much more was possible for her and the people she loved than pain. But then she started falling asleep and waking up paralyzed in other bodies. And I'll stop there.
You muted, Renee.
Ay, sorry. 2 years. It just takes some of us longer. Maybe another 2. I don't know. So
That's totally fair.
the writing was beautiful. And I read all 306 pages. And I was in there. You know, I was in the scenes and feeling it and trying to understand. And then I started sort of reflecting through the lens of our office, which is the Office of Human Rights. And some of the themes that you really addressed were really deep, you know, because it really gave a different way to think about things. And so the first vignette that you read was actually one of the questions. This sort of, I don't know if you were meaning to, but, and maybe, you know, you could talk to us about that, but sort of the social media aspect, you just sort of touched it, but it is woven throughout it. And this whole thing about how we treat each other, you know, how the jogger sees this thing, talks about it, and then gets all of the, you know, I call it the hit and run, you know, because you wouldn't do that to a person face to face. You wouldn't have the guts, you know, but you feel that you can write and comment on the looks of somebody when that has nothing to do with, you know, the tweet, the criticism, the indifference of people. So I thought, you know, I'd like to ask you to comment sort of about that.
Yeah, no, I think definitely social media is something that I was very much cognizant of in this book, even though it doesn't really come up that often. Like, it's kind of on the fringes. I don't really mention it too often. But I think the thing about that you're talking about that I think is really resonant to My Volcano is the way in which just things explode, like nowadays. Like something happens and then suddenly you're like a meme, and like suddenly everyone's making fun of you and everyone's talking about what you look like and like all these things. It's just like suddenly, like as soon as you're like a little bit in the public view, like there's just all of these like myriad interpretations that suddenly sort of erupt, and then you're boring the next day. You know, I think that was something that I was definitely sort of playing with. I mean, even the volcano is something that was like, oh, this weird thing is growing in Central Park, and then like a few days later, like nobody gives a crap. Like nobody cares that this thing is growing in Central Park anymore, because it's just like, okay, it's boring. And then suddenly they're like, once they determine it's a volcano, suddenly it's interesting again. And you know, all of these sort of things that, like, you know, and that sort of shines as well to sort of a lot of things that happen on social media, a lot of like these terrible things that happen. suddenly we get a little bit bored of it. And, just even with the pandemic, like we're all sick of it. So we stop thinking about it and stop tweeting about it. And it's just like, it doesn't mean it goes away.
Right.
But it's totally, I think a lot of that stuff is definitely like in this book, even if the social media stuff is a little bit removed. And I hope you don't hear my dog chewing on his bone. But...
No.
Okay,
no,
good.
not yet. But you're right. I was struck. To me, it was woven, sort of always here, but very mindful. The life stream, right?
Yeah.
I have questions about that, but I have another question. But Kyla, I don't want to.
No, go ahead.
Again, it's not often I get to have the author to answer my questions from a book.
Yeah.
So, I was also struck about sort of the symbolism and the beauty of how you wrote about the teacher, right? He shows up sort of in the beginning and he's woven throughout, but particularly about how, he wakes up on the street and he's not seen. And then when he goes to Central Park and is kind of like in this crush of people, right, that he hasn't been touched in so long and sort of not being seen as a human. I'd like you to comment on that because that was so touching.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we should say that the teacher is homeless. He's not a teacher anymore. A former teacher, current homeless man. Yeah. I mean, I think, that's sort of, the fun challenge is always trying to think about like what sort of characters I can have exist in this thing. And I think, I don't think I'd ever written a character who had an experience with homelessness exactly before. And it just, to me, it seems like this, I've been to New York. I know that the level of disgust and the level of like, do not look at the homeless people that people are in New York. Like, cause it's like scenery. Like, it's just like a lamppost. It's just like a guy that's just like living on the street. Like, it's very much this, just like the volcano is like another thing that you're just walking by and just trying to ignore and trying to just sort of like pretend that you're, there isn't this sort of like immense suffering right next to you. I think that's something I was totally, I think it was something I was particularly struck by in New York, just like seeing, I went to school in Long Island, so I spent time in Manhattan. I took classes in Manhattan and just like seeing the level of just, how Manhattan, just like people just losing their minds in the street. And it's just heartbreaking. And like, I think because I wasn't growing up there, like it seemed like so much like, how do people tolerate like living here? And like, I worked in Midtown for a while also after grad school. And it's just like, I don't know, like, I don't think I ever got used to it, but it seems like everybody else just was, I don't know. So I think Jahan was a character that I don't know. I'm very happy with Jahan in this book, even though he doesn't, I don't know if he has it's an interest. I don't know how to talk about him in this story, if we think he's tragic or not. I mean, he gets a weird transformation at some point, but yeah, he's one of my favorites, I think, though.
Yeah. Well, his just seeing life through his eyes and seeing the struggle through his eyes.
Yeah.
The real life challenges that so many have. His decision, I won't give it away, but does he do something that will make his life easier or will maybe help him mend relationship? It was fascinating, just sort of this snapshot, this vignette. I agree with you, sort of New York. Like you can go, if you don't live there, and you can go one weekend and have like the best time. And then the next weekend, you're suddenly like somebody's pulled you up by the collar because you're having this great time and you look and there's this person that's come in or where you're eating or is just leaving and, going through the garbage and you're thinking, this is a human being. Like, how can this exist in the same parallel, the same plane that I am? And it's tragic. And how can this be in a country that's supposed to be so advanced and so, all of these things. So I really appreciate it. In few words, how you convey sort of all of this conflict.
Yeah. The thing I wanted to do with My Volcano is sort of just have a book where, the advantage of having a million characters, I mean, not a million, but there's many, many characters. I think that one of the effects it has on the reader is like making us understand how many different worlds exist in our world. I mean, Jahan's Manhattan is completely different than Ash's Manhattan,
That's right.
despite the fact that he was at some point sleeping underneath one of Ash's vans for that Sunshine Juice
That's
Company
right.
commercial. Like they're
That's
so
right.
close to one another, but they're so vastly different at the same time, and their experiences are so different. I think that's one of the things that I as a human try to remember, and I think is one of those things that, you know, I want readers to sort of have to sort of reckon with the idea of like, yeah, your world is your world, but there's all of these other ones that you have to just, you don't know what's going on in everyone else's life. And I think that, you know, even just acknowledging that, I think, is a first step towards us being able to at least have sympathy for one another.
That's right. Humanity. And one other thing, and then Kyla, I'll mute, as I always say, but you know, this whole idea, and you talked about it just a moment ago, this fear of looking somebody in the eye, right? If we're not comfortable, like, do we look at this homeless person? Do we, right? But they are a human being. Don't we want people to look in our eye? Don't we want to be acknowledged as not being invisible, right? So it's just, it makes you really think. And I guess for some, it's like, well, if I look, then maybe, you know, I'm being disrespectful, or I don't know. The same thing I think with differently abled persons that are, you know, visibly differently abled. Like, you know, we're guilty of looking through because of our, you know, discomfort. So it's all very.
Yeah, you don't want to be caught staring, or just be like, if I look at a homeless person and then don't give them money, then I'm being acknowledged as ignoring this person, instead of just like, oh, don't look over there, like knowing, and you know, it's perception, even though it's all the same thing at the end of the day. You know, I don't know. It is very weird.
It is, but it's good. Go ahead, Kyla.
Well, I just like, as we're talking about visibility and invisibility, which I saw as a theme here.
Oh yeah.
And you know, you've just been talking about the homeless, seeing somebody who's like down and out from whatever our perspective is.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, I mean, certainly is familiar to me, that I wrestle with. Sometimes I don't wrestle with, and then afterwards I'm like, I'm a terrible person, and I carry that around with a sack for the rest of my life. And sometimes I get it right next, and sometimes I don't. But I think we all have this experience. And so then there's also those of us who have been looked through for various reasons. And one of the things that this book also talks about, with, especially from, if my memory is correct, particularly from the point of view of the white trans writer, character who's identified as a white trans writer, these moments of like seeking invisibility, and then also like seeing one's own reflection, and like not wanting to see one's own reflection. And I mean, I can relate to that feeling of like wanting to disappear inside oneself, like not wanting to be visible. And and then how do you reconcile your own face, you know, and all of those kinds. I thought it was deep.
There's a lot of real feelings of mine in there. The white trans writers are really like closely, seemingly metafictional character for those listening. It's more or less slightly me.
I felt that might be who I was seeing there, and that journey, and how the way that you played with the visibility and invisibility both being done to us, and then that internal journey, I thought was really really on point. And I was wondering, can you talk, I mean, again, I don't want to necessarily give away the whole book or anything, but can you talk a little bit about that journey in the book?
I mean, there's so many invisibility. I mean, even the volcano and this like being seen and then being ignored is sort of the same thing as being visible and being invisible. So it's one of the things that's sort of played with throughout that. I think the white trans writer obviously has that going on in sort of very conflicted ways. Like they're both not looking at their own reflection and sort of like purposely trying to sort of avoid seeing themselves as something that they don't relate to. And then there's also that scene where they go to the Pride Parade and feel like so invisible, even in being like, oh, this is supposed to make me feel like I'm part of a community, but I don't at all. Like, this is just like, I cannot be, like, I am standing here and nobody can see me. If I can't be seen even here, like, I don't know, there's a lot of really sort of my own sort of tragic feelings about community, and especially things like that. And that was just like a real experience that I had where I went to, I'm not visibly very trans looking. Like people think that I'm a dude, like that's just my life. But, just going there and just feeling like, yeah, like I totally am queer, but like I just look like another random person on the street, and just feeling so distant from all of this like seeming joy, and also like the corporateness of pride. Like that also is sort of something that's playing with there, like all the politicians and stuff just like going through there. It's kind of a joke, but I don't know, like that was just like a real experience that I don't know. It's something it's just like a me thing that I was playing with. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, do you have any moments about invisibility that you want me to speak to particularly? But I think there's all sorts of like, particularly the marginalized characters being invisible, or like, a character like Galena who wakes up inside of a giant insect and sort of isn't seen as being like, people just see this insect and assume that it's her. Like it's sort of a different kind of invisibility in its own way. And that also weirdly empowers Galena to sort of like, the bug is almost like a sort of closet in its own way. And she's able to sort of like, by being not seen, be able to sort of like think about this sort of queer desire that she's been has just been sort of like lurking in the back of her mind. So it's I think invisibility is both a liberating and a very diminishing experience. And I think that's, I don't think it comes out one way or the other at the end, but just the many facets of invisibility.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really liked about this is and actually this is true with Vanishing Monuments too, that in Vanishing Monuments, which was for those people watching at home who don't know what I'm talking about, this was Jess's first novel, right? First novel? Yeah. Second book, first novel. And it's really, really excellent. And there it is on the screen. And that there is a trans character in that book that uses the pronouns Z and Zir.
Yeah.
And in My Volcano, one of the things I really appreciated was seeing several different trans characters who had different ways of referring to themselves. And I personally, and I read a lot, that is not something that I feel like we do not see a lot of trans characters in literature. And as we talk about books as being empathy machines, or that's not mine, I'm stealing that from Neil Gaiman, but we need to see characters who are written. And so I really value that about this work. And you have correct me, so you've got the white trans writer, Ash. And
yeah.
Was there?
There's gotta be other ones. There's gotta be a third one. Yeah. I mean, there could have been more, but I mean, there's all sorts of, I mean, I feel like there might be a third one that I'm just not remembering, but.
The Brazilian student wasn't?
No, he was just disabled and queer. Sorry, my dog is freaking out right now. Okay.
But really just appreciating seeing different voices and experiences, and that actually does leave it. I'm sorry, Renee. No, I'm taking all the questions. I'm going to ask one more. I'll have it back over. But one of the things is, you have so many different people and different geographies represented, and actually some of them were very familiar because I used to live. Actually, we just saw this is my dad from Hawaii. So I used to live in Hawaii, and there's a lot of sort of familiar geographical places, but they're not necessarily familiar all in one book. So I wanted to know, how did you decide where we were going to be and where different characters were going to be geographically?
Yeah, no, that was sort of, I mean, I think it was somewhat, I mean, it was very intentional that I wanted to sort of have it be global. So there's a lot of characters from a lot of various, or at least with connections to certain parts of the world. Like I don't think there's a little bit of stuff in like North Africa, and like, Duncan is from Nigeria. So, I mean, there's a little bit of connection there. Australia, I think, is the only place that maybe never gets mentioned in terms of continents. Like they got the rough end of the stick somehow in this one. But yeah, I kind of just wanted I wanted it to be set kind of like all around the world as much as possible, because I wanted it to be, as much as I wanted this book to be about America, and I think it is about America, I wanted to be sort of a book about the world, like the state of things beyond that. Like I didn't want it to be sort of pegged as this, I also said it in 2016, kind kind of particularly because I didn't want it to be, I didn't want it to be a post-Trump book. I wanted it to be a pre-Trump book, because it was like, it would be so easy if this was set in 2017 to be like, yeah, this is Trump's America, but this was America before we ever got here. Like, this is just where the world was going. So that was really intentional. But I think around wanting to sort of have it be the sort of global, I mean, that also ties in with a lot of the sort of like climate and sort of general sort of like state of the world anxieties that the book talks to, and sort of like, you know, this idea of wanting to sort of like understand all of these different worlds existing in one, and sort of like, we're all in this together, sort of like, you know, as cheesy as that sounds, I think that's somewhat what it's trying to do. Yeah.
No, it is true. I actually have two questions. Or statements. I don't know. One, I really was struck by, it's 95. When you talk about the shadows following the people in New York City and telling them about their past, and they're not listening, and then they climb into their ears at night where they can't, you know, ignore them anymore. It was so beautifully written and just so true. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, I feel like that's one of those things that like I almost cut, but weirdly, like a few people have been like, that part really struck me. I don't know. I mean, the book is all about like the volcano as this sort of like thing that is obviously so dangerous, but that nobody wants to acknowledge its danger for the most part. And that's sort of just kind of pulling that idea to the personal, and all these sort of things about ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge or don't want to sort of like look at are the things that are sort of like haunting us. And if we were able to sort of like look at this thing indirectly, like maybe we would be okay. I mean, that section says like maybe everything would be kind of fine if everyone just turned around and said, or if anyone actually, it was like, if anyone looks at this ghost and like acknowledges it, like they will all be freed of it. But nobody wants to do that, because it's just, you know, I mean, this book is in some ways, I think, talking about the sort of human nature to look away from difficult things, which is a survival tactic, of course. Like, I don't necessarily write about that in a sense of like, you should feel bad for not wanting to like think about Ukraine right now. It's just like, well, you know, if you want to get through your day, you might need to do that. You know, there's all sorts of things that we have to, I think, just know how much you can, you know, we can be so easily overwhelmed by things, and you just have to like understand your relationship to this sort of stuff. I don't know. I think that's definitely what I was sort of playing with. It's sort of like personalizing this sort of more social idea of the volcano, and sort of being like, all these people are going through their own little things. So I think that's also the thing that this book is trying to say, is that everyone's got this, everyone's life is on fire kind of in its own way.
You know, and I agree. And also, but I was very particularly struck by the fact that to me, what I drew from it was that, you know, if you don't, whenever it's right, sort of start dealing with some of the personal issues that we each have, right? And as you said, there's a season and a time, and maybe it's too much that you can't deal with it, right? But that the insidiousness of that is that it does climb into your head, into your ear, as you sort of described it in this picturesque way. And, you know, on the street you can ignore it, but at some point, right? So I just
once your head hits the pillow, that's when it comes out to whisper to you. I mean, that's seems to be my experience with life. And, you know, as soon as something is like even like somewhat to your awareness, like it's just going to haunt you till you deal with it. I think that's been true for me with a lot of things, for sure.
It's very relatable for all of us. The other question I had, and Kyle and I talked about it, and, you know, as you put in front of some chapters, I was trying to figure out if there was a pattern that I was missing, or whether it was just there to torment me to figure out if there was a pattern. But, you know, the listing of real people that died, you know, tragically murdered. They were all murdered, not by police all, but by, you know, people who've, right? So maybe speak to that. What is the symbolism? Is it something that I'm supposed to take? How does it fit in with my volcano?
Yeah, I mean, part of that, I mean, that this is one of those things where I do kind of want to leave it up to the reader to sort of have their own responses to this. But I think that, in general, I can say as much that those sort of represent some of the volcanoes that I sort of see that we are not like looking at enough, mostly being white supremacy, but also homophobia and transphobia and all of these sort of intersections of these things, like those. And yeah, I mean, a book set also in 2016, like it seems weird to not note some of the horrible things that happened in 2016. I mean, we all thought 2020 was bad, but I'd already written this book and I was like, 2016 was way worse. I mean, in some ways, I mean, it was like, there were so many things. And so, and that made 2020 feel weirder to me, having written this book, because I wrote this book in basically like 2019, I finished it. And like, as soon as George Floyd happened and all that stuff, all the Black Lives Matter stuff and all the other killings that happened after that, it really was like, man, how did this not happen in 2016? Like, why didn't we protest like this? And I mean, obviously, I think the pandemic was a part of that. It sort of somehow awakened people, or sort of like freed them to sort of just be angry about something else. I don't know. I don't know what it was, but it seemed to me like, how did we not go through this 4 years ago? Like knowing all the things that I had in my book, like, it's like, man, that was a bad summer.
Yeah, I think it points beautifully to the whole thing that you're writing about, like this volcano in the middle of Central Park.
Yeah.
That our attention after 2 days or 3 days, it's like, big yawn, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it just really ties it together beautifully that all of these things, as you said, happened. Yeah. And we're all just kind of like,
yeah. Right? I mean, I'm kind of glad that 2020 somewhat proved my book wrong in certain ways, because it proved that, like, oh, we can turn towards this thing, specifically with George Floyd. And like, oh, we do have the ability to like give some sustained attention to this like really serious issue that's going on in America, going around all around the world. But, and then also like, as we're getting into 2022, I'm like, well, I was right about the pandemic though, the way that we're like, oh, this is over. And it's like, no, it hasn't been over for a very long time. And it's not going to be over for a little while yet. And it's just like, but we've decided that we're not going to look at that volcano anymore. Like,
well, exactly. To delude ourselves still.
Yeah.
If we don't acknowledge, then it doesn't exist.
That doesn't work with viruses.
Right.
Yeah.
I've got lots of questions, but Kyla, I don't want to steal Jess.
So I live in Greenbelt, Maryland, which is home of Goddard Space Flight Center. And so everyone and their mom is an astrophysicist. And so, hi, everyone and their mom watching from Greenbelt. So as I was reading this, of course, there's volcanology and there's like lots of astrophysics things and many other things. And I was wondering, I mean, it's a very intellectual book. And I was wondering, how did you come to tell me about how did we get so much astronomy in here? What brought it in?
I don't know. I mean, I think I'm always, as a writer, I'm very conscious of the fact that I always write about artists, I think, somewhat. And I think I like to write about people who are passionate about stuff. And I think I'm very much like, as much as possible, whenever I can see an out, I will make someone not an artist. Like, I'm going to make them a scientist. I also, I think, used to be really interested in science when I was in like high school. And like, I think some part of me is mourning that. So I've just got all these sort of fascinations and curiosities. So I love to be able to sort of like have an excuse to learn about stuff like volcanology and astronomy. I mean, I think that the astronomer, I think it was a good choice for me to have a character who was very ostensibly not looking at the world and was looking for these sort of other worlds and these sort of like, I think it opens the book up in this interesting way to have this character who's sort of obsessed with finding exoplanets, like that. The character of Joao is like, I think helpful in sort of opening that up. But also, that character is I think somewhat inspired by this documentary called Nostalgia for the Light, which is about the astronomy that goes on in the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is where Joao is, but it's also about the Atacama Desert and the sort of thinking about like looking at like the evidence of like very, very ancient indigenous civilizations that live there, as well as these people who are going through and like combing the sand for their like dead husbands that were killed by Pinochet, because most of Augusto Pinochet is, whoever he disappeared, like some of those people are sort of thought to be have just been buried in the desert. So it's this very interesting documentary about like stuff that's like so far away. It's just looking at like very weird noises and stuff, like very deep astrophysics and astronomy, as well as this sort of like, historical like genocide politics and just like, just the weirdness of time and space in that documentary, I think sort of inspired me to sort of, that's what sort of put that place in my mind for sure.
Did you have to research, or did you know a lot of things going in, or did you like the Messier objects and things? Did you learn? Did you learn
I didn't
that
know
for
about
the
Messier objects. That was a really cool thing that I had to learn about in terms of doing the astronomy stuff. Yeah, no, I didn't know a lot of that stuff going in necessarily. Like I had known Nostalgia for the Light. That was sort of where I sort of pulled Chile and the Atacama Desert as a setting for a character. But a lot of this, I didn't know that much about volcanoes until I started writing a book about a volcano. Like, I think that's part of what makes the sort of like immense work of a novel sometimes so exciting to me, is that I have to sort of like figure some stuff out. And I think that's what's so enjoyable, is like finding out about Messier objects and seeing the way that I can use that metaphorically in the book was so perfect to me, but it was also so natural from just my doing research, rather than sort of like, necessarily ham-fisting thing like this is what I'm going to go for. Like, I don't know. I feel like great. It's a fun discovery, like sifting, you're like panning for metaphor when you're doing this research.
Well, the line in there that you have about that is just totally on point, and it's not heavy. It's just perfect. And Renee, I know you have a question, so I'm going to stop hogging the the
I
mic.
always have questions, but I wanted to talk a little bit about. Boy, I sounded Canadian there, didn't I?
You did. I'm super.
We're rubbing off on you.
Yeah, super proud.
Yes. So, this notion of the life stream, and it was fascinating to me, sort of. So how, the life stream, particularly of Duncan, and why people found solace watching somebody doing nothing, and why particularly Athene watched after it was very clear that Duncan and
Hitomi
packed and left, and just sort of watched the way you painted it, the shadows, right? It was beautiful, but unpack that for me, because there's just some things like, I don't know, I've got lots of questions.
I don't know. I think there's just a weird, I was thinking about just the way that we can, this may also just be me, like the way that a lot of people in my generation are sort of like, caught up in watching people just streaming stuff. And it's just like a lot of like, there's a lot of things that people watch that have like so little content. It's sort of like ASMR, where it's just like this video that you watch because it just makes you feel something for some reason. And it's just like, it could be like someone just like brushing their hair. Like, it's just kind of useless. I don't know. I don't know that people actually do like stream their life in that way. Like, if people probably do, I sort of just made that up and was just like, people probably do that. I didn't do any, there's some stuff I don't do research on. I'm just like, that's a cool idea. I'm not going to bother to like look it up. Like, this person is easily, you could do that where you just set up a stream where people can just like flip through some cameras and just watch you. It's like security camera. But yeah, I don't know. I think people are just fascinated by very strange things. And I think that's just like something I wanted to sort of like have this acknowledgement of. And yeah, I don't know about that moment with Etna watching the sort of empty apartment is sort of very creepy, especially because of the way that it feels like it's sort of like moving, despite the fact that it hopefully isn't. But yeah, I think that's sort of like leading to that's near the end when things are getting particularly strange and particularly surreal in certain ways. So, it leaves all this I think, room for the reader to be like, well, what is real, what is not, and that's very high, peak that feeling is around when that's happening, I think.
Yeah. You hit it, the nail on the head. I was also thinking from the other perspective, like, why would you want somebody to watch you?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I mean, I think that's another thing is like, some people just want to be seen. I mean, it's sort of like, it's like, not voyeurism, but like exhibitionism, sort of like, some people just want to be perceived. I mean, it sort of goes into sort of like invisibility and visibility, like just the idea of people like watching you. It's sort of like, I think, therefore I am. It's sort of like, I'm seen, therefore I am. Like, it's sort of like idea that like, if someone's watching me, maybe my life is worth watching, or maybe I'm actually existing. I don't know. I think there's all sorts of weird kind of perceptions of that. And obviously that's also Etna and Duncan just sort of have this relationship where they want to sort of be long distance. Like this weird distance is the thing that makes the most sense to them.
right.
And it's very strange, but it works so much better than them being in the same place. So it was just a very interesting sort of character study that I just wanted to sort of think about. Yeah.
The other thing that struck me, and then so that Kyla can also have a chance, but this thing about when she's in the apartment in Jersey, or it's out after the eruption, and she wants to go back to live stream. She's staying in the extra room of her friend, and so one camera isn't enough because she doesn't want to play to the camera, right?
Yeah.
But you're still aware of it, so you set 2 up so you can be natural. It's just very sort of mind-boggling for someone, I guess, not of your generation.
I mean,
like,
I don't know that people
intrusive.
do this, but yeah, I think it's just, I mean, that's what I like. I like to have characters that are a little bit strange, or in these sort of strange situations, because it gives me I like to sort of like think about like, well, if I was in that situation, I mean, if I was going to stream my life, I wouldn't want to. And if people could switch the cameras, I don't want to like necessarily just have one thing that I always have to be, because then I can't be natural. But if there's like 50 cameras, I can't play to all of them. So I'm just going to live my life. So that was sort of the sort of way that I was thinking about that particularly. But don't expect that my generation does this. I don't know that anyone does this. I've still not researched it. I'm sure people do, but yeah. It's
a great concept. Yeah.
But I think it has enough shades in like what we really do. And I'm saying like what we really do. Like I think about, I'm now off Facebook again for like the 5th time. I keep ducking in. But I mean, I got on Facebook in 2007. And I was early in, and I really did, like, if I had a thought, like I go back now when I was on it and I would see things I posted in 2007 and I'd be like, I had a thought. Like, I mean, basically,
no, exactly.
But it was like to be seen. And I think you've hit on something, like to be seen is to exist. And there's something like that. And I think it is a weird, but it's very real. I think that when I read this with this idea that if I'm seeing 400 people are watching me lie in bed in my apartment, that I somehow matter. Exactly.
I mean, it's also just like, I mean, in terms of like talking about social media, that's a sort of metaphor, sort of allegory, I think, for the way that we exist with social media. Like you're talking about with Facebook. I mean, it's just like, this thing that we go on that does nothing but cause us misery, but somehow, I don't know, like, I mean, I may be speaking out of turn and just about myself, but I think that there's this idea of like, I have to be on this thing because this is where people see other people. And it's just like, I don't know. I think that the same impulse to be on social media is the impulse that causes you to put 2 webcams in your apartment and have people watch you. I mean, it's not that weird if you think about it at the end of the day. I mean, it's in some ways more invasive, but in other ways, it's just you being seen. I don't know. It's not as different as it sounds to me, at least.
No, that's a great way to look at it. For someone who, I have Facebook. I have posted literally 3 things in the years, probably 2007 as well. And it's, thank you for my birthday wish, right? Perhaps 3 different years. I go on, I look, but I don't actually, it sucks your life. Like, so I don't. To me, it feels so much like work. So after I've worked 10 or 12 hours, the last thing I want to do is go on Facebook. And then 3 hours later, that's 3 hours I will never get back. And for what?
Yeah, and it's just another performance. Like you
Yeah,
can't be
it's like,
honest.
yeah.
I mean,
But
you can try, but I think it's still like this weird. I don't know. I think I'd rather set up 5 webcams
right,
in my
right.
apartment than start up my Facebook again. So like,
Yeah.
No,
like
I
I
hear
think that
you. I
sounds
hear you.
that sounds more honest to me and more, I don't know, enriching than, that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because it's also
Well,
like all it is selfish, kind of. And so like, why do I need to see you? Like I just want you to see me. So like, I'm just gonna set up my camera. It's not gonna look at you. So that's sort of what we do on Instagram. I mean,
Yeah,
like you're on Twitter, you're just yelling into the void. It's just like
Yeah.
you're
yeah.
screaming your ideas and like kind of sometimes asking for feedback, but it's usually just, old man
No,
yelling
you're
at
right.
cloud.
Right.
It does encourage narcissism. Like, tell us what it's like. Nobody cares what I'm doing. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
that interested. I'm not that
Exactly.
important.
Yeah.
I've never answered like, oh, I just, drank. What? Who cares?
Yeah.
That's just my personal opinion.
Wow.
I sympathize. I don't like the idea of being seen or thought of as interesting. It's just like
Wow.
nobody cares what I think. Like I go on Twitter and I'm just like, if I don't have a joke, like I'm not going to post something.
No.
Well, I mean, that's what I
Yeah.
mean. Or if you're truly soliciting like an engagement and
Yeah,
conversation,
yeah.
that's different. That's great
Yeah,
to kind of
yeah.
exchange ideas and get discussion going. But
And I mean, I think it's great to do whatever the hell you want to do on
I agree.
on social media. Like I don't
agree.
care.
I'm just talking
but
about me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
When I was reading this, I have to say, of course, I'm pretty sure it's been a minute, but Kurt Vonnegut and I think Breakfast of Champions. I'm trying to remember which title it was, but I think
Yeah.
that's the one. And others. I mean, there's other. I mean, Kafka, of course. So did you?
Yeah.
Was this intentional homage? And who else? Who did I miss in there?
I mean, I think there's a lot of probably unintentional homage. I mean, the Kafka thing is impossible to say is unintentional. It's just person wakes up inside of a giant insect. Obviously, it is a callback to the Metamorphosis. I think Vonnegut is probably in my bones in some way. It had been a while since I'd read Vonnegut, but I think his sort of humanity and humor and sort of his weird sci-fi-ness, like certainly I think is probably in there. I don't think it was conscious though. And I think there's all sorts of unconscious, like, Gogol as a weird writer that really like spoke to me, or there are books that were sort of consciously thought about, like Thomas King's Green Grass Running Water.
Oh, it's one.
Like it's a great book. There you go.
One of my favorites. You got to read it, people.
Yeah,
So totally quick plug for Thomas King.
Yeah, totally read that book. But I think the sort of, the mythicness of that book and the satire of that book. I mean, that book is so heavily satire compared to mine, and so like pointy in a way that mine's not necessarily pointy like that. But there's a way that sort of like the spirituality of that book, I think, inspired some of the more spiritual stuff in my book. Despite that mine does not have any sort of like real world, like, Thomas King says very like clearly like indigenous, spirituality. And like mine is just like surreal spirituality. But I think there's a sort of like mythic feeling to that book that I really appreciate and really sort of spilled into my thinking about My Volcano. And also, of course, like having multiple characters and sort of revolving around these things, these different characters sort of overlap, but kind of don't. That was definitely a book that I was thinking about. But yeah, there's probably all sorts of stuff that I can't. Like I was reading a friend who did a staff rec of my book, called it Queer Vonnegut. If you like this book, you'd like this book if you like Queer Vonnegut and Widening Gyres, which reminded me of the poem The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats, because it has this sort of like idea of this gyre and like the falcon cannot hear the falconer, and it's like this weird like this beast that's slouching towards that Bethlehem to be born. And I was just like reading that the other day. I was like, I think this poem plagiarized my book, despite if it came out like 1910 or something. Like, I was like, this book, like this poem, like is something that I love this poem, but I was not thinking about it at all. But I was like reading it, I was like, man, this is like My Volcano, like all of this stuff, like the sort of like entropy of that poem was like, yeah, you could definitely like read this poem and be like, this is a ripoff of My Volcano, or I'm more or less probably ripping off Yeats. But so there's all sorts of stuff that I can't really like. I hesitate to point too many fingers because there's all sorts of fingers that are, I think I described it somewhere as like I'm like a parrot who's been like just collected all of these sort of like words from people, and like I don't know where they came from, but there's definitely a lot of callbacks to, or sort of just, you know, all sorts of kinds of storytelling in this book, and I think it's kind of an homage to that in general. But those are a few people that I can probably very specifically point to.
Awesome. Thank you. Renee, we've got time for one more if you want to.
Okay, yeah, because you know, you very literary writer types, right? My question is not erudite like that, but I wanted to talk about Easy Rupt. It was brilliant. Talk about the symbolism. Like, talk to me about that.
Yeah. So Easy Rupt is this startup that's sort of like an emotion managing service where you got to just go into this. And these things actually exist to some degree. One of those things that I also just kind of wrote, but I didn't do any research, but these things exist. Like, it's sort of a room where you can go and like, it's like break stuff or whatever. Like Easy Rupt is a little bit more intense than that, because it sort of also has like a Faraday cage built into it, so your phone can't get reception. It's sort of like putting your phone in a microwave. Like, you can't get reception inside of this thing. It's just this, yeah. And so it's this thing that exists in both Manhattan and San Francisco in the book, and that's where Michaela works, the character that was having this sort of like night terrors. And yeah, it's just this, you know, obviously this very expensive way. And I was even thinking about, like, obviously, like, you know, coming all the way back to Jahan and the sort of like publicness of his meltdowns compared to the fact that these rich people can go into this room and just scream for half an hour and spend like $500 and just break a bunch of stuff. And suddenly, like, that's how they get their sort of like breakdown, or like release this sort of like pressure in them. And so it's very much this kind of, I don't know, like a criticism of the sort of startup bouginess, of course. Because I worked in a sort of tech startup at some point. And it was not like that, but it was, you know, I don't know. So I think there's a bit of that that's going on there. But obviously this sort of, just this idea that we all have this sort of stuff that we want to just like emote or like feel something, like this is a play, and how inaccessible that is, especially for a lot of people. I mean, even Michaela is like, I can't afford to do this. Like, it would be nice. Like, she's not having the best time, but like she doesn't have the ability to sort of like do this thing that these people have. So, you know, I don't know. It's sort of like releasing of energy and like releasing of emotion without like consequence is not a thing that most people are privileged enough to have, even, which is scary. And then it just explodes. I mean, that's what volcanoes do. If they build up enough pressure, they'll just blow up. Yeah.
And sort of this notion of paying extra to have somebody witness it. Talk to me a little bit about that. That symbolism.
Yeah, that was just a way of just adding extra creepiness to this sort of like power dynamic of this. Like, yeah, like being rich enough to spend like $500 or $1,000 to like just sit there and like emote in a booth, but then also be like, I want you to witness that. So you have to sit there and watch me do it.
Yeah. And not show anything. Like,
yeah. It's a very
brilliant.
Weird power dynamic that's going on there. It's very creepy. Yeah.
It's brilliant.
I hope that one doesn't exist. I think things like that exist, but hopefully not in that way.
Right. Because you're right.
But I'm sure that that's not true. I'm sure that would happen, you know.
Yeah. Sort of that.
It is, but I think the whole idea of like a rage room is interesting too. Like, what's happening in our society that in real life that we do, like we'll pay to go and break stuff. Like and I thought that this book with the rooms there, like it really brings out like how odd that is, that this is where we've come to. You know?
Yeah, like there's a market for people to just spend hundreds of dollars to just scream for 30 minutes or to just be offline for 30 minutes or like whatever it is. Like, it's just like, why can't, I mean, these are things that like humans should be allowed to do, but it seems so inaccessible and so, you know, punished in some way to sort of be emotional in public at the very least. It's hard being human.
That is a takeaway.
That is out on that.
It's a little more hopeful than it sounds. I'll say that. Hopefully.
Was that lemonade, Jess?
Yeah, I wish it's seltzer, but one day.
All right.
So this has been amazing, and so unfortunately we are at time, so we have to wrap it up. So here we are. We have the book. You can get your copy in the absolute best way that you can support writers, guests that come and talk to us here at the Office of Human Rights and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System is by buying their book. This book came out 2 days ago. It's everywhere. It's super, super hot. So you should run and get your copy now. You can order it from your favorite independent bookstore. You can probably take it out from your favorite library if your favorite library is Prince George's County Memorial Library System. You can, but we really do encourage you. It's a wonderful book, and it is a book for our time. And as we talked about tonight, maybe a little bit even more for our time than was maybe anticipated when you wrote it, Jess. But it really is. It's really on point, and I absolutely loved it. It was wonderful. So I appreciate you, Renee Battlebrooks, who I forgot to introduce at the beginning. She's the executive director of the Office of Human Rights. Thank you so much for being with us. And very quickly, I will say we do have a couple. Actually, very quickly, let me say this: we mentioned some other books that are good to read. So I put a link to The Second Coming in the chat for any of you watching. We also mentioned Thomas King's Green Grass Running Water, which is an excellent book. But while we're on the subject of Thomas King, if you live in the United States and you're wondering what is going on with Indigenous people, The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King does an incredible job of introducing really the state's impact, I'm trying to think of the right word, on Indigenous people in Canada and the United States. And I think it's a great introductory book for anybody who's maybe interested. And we also talked about Kurt Vonnegut, so make sure you check out him as well. And we have our diversity dialogue next week with the library system on Tuesday. You can check out all of our events by either checking out the library at pgcmls.info/events or by going to our office, tinyurl.com/pgcohr events. I will have that memorized one day soon. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you, Jess.
Good night.
Good night.